B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Yevamot Daf Tes. We're going to start 4 lines from the bottom of Daf Ches Amud Beis. And we've seen in the previous sugya that the Bryce on Daf Gimel learned after a lot of discussion, but it's clear from that Brysa that from the word Oleho and Litzroir in the Posuk, which is discussing Yibum, or it's actually discussing Achois Isha, but we learn from there that B'mokim Mitzvah, where there's Yibum, then if Shimon dies without children and he's got a wife or 2 wives, and one of his wives is an erva to Reuven may not do Yibum or Chalitza, not with the erva or with the Tzoras erva. That's b'mokim mitzvah. Sheloi b'mokim mitzvah. If somebody else, Don, was married to a woman who happens to be the wife of, to be the sister of Reuven's wife, and then this Don has a second wife, and then this Don divorces, he dies or he divorces his wife, that second wife, then Reuven is allowed to marry this wife that was a rival wife with his wife's sister. There's no Isser of Tzora, Sheloi b'mkei mitzvah. We learn that from Oleho and Litzroir. Rabbi, however, learnt from the extra words, from the extra letter, the Hey of V'lokcho and V'yibmo, that these halachas. The question is, according to Rabbi, what does he do with the word Oleho? That's what the Gemara is going to discuss. The Rabbi, Hai Oleho. This word Oleho, my Ovidle, what's he going to use it for? Answers the Gemara, Miboile Lekadetanya. He uses it for the following Mishnayos, the Brisa that we're about to learn. And just a short introduction to make this really simple. And that is that we know there's a halacha that there are certain averos that if a person does them b'mezid, he's chayiv koros. In the event that there's edim and hasra, it could be there's even a chiyuv misa. It's zadoinoi b'koros, and if he does that avera b'shoigig by mistake, then he brings a chatos. And that's a general rule that any chatos, a chatos is only ever brought for those isurim, when a person by mistake does an avera, that when done intentionally is the doinoi b'koros, then the shoigig is b'chatos. Now we're going to have 2 brackets of these types of averas. You've got the general averos, which are zedoinei b'koros, and then you've got the averos which are associated to avodah zarah. Now in each of these 2 groups, there are 4 different categories. There are 4 different people who may have done these averos intentionally or by mistake. We're now discussing chatos, we're discussing if they did it by mistake. You've got a regular yochid, an individual who did one of these averos by mistake. Then you've got another type of individual, which is called a kohen moshiach, an anointed kohen, a kohen gadol, who does this avera by mistake. And then you've got a nosi, a certain type of leader. There's a concept called a nosi of Klal Yisrael, and he's got his halachas if he makes a mistake and transgresses one of these averas. And then you've got, if Roiv Klal Yisrael, due to a mistaken ruling from the Beis Din, that the Beis Din said a certain activity, that something was mutter, and really it transpired afterwards, it was actually one of these averas which are punishable by koros when done intentionally, then they have to also bring a chatos, but they have different halachas. So we've got a yochid, a Beis Din, or roiv or all of Klal Yisrael, and then you've got number 3, the kohen moshiach, and number 4, a nosi. And then we've got the same bracket, the same group regarding avodah zarah. When a yochid does an avera of avodah zarah by mistake, when a Beis Din give a ruling and that makes most of Klal Yisrael do an avera by mistake of avodah zarah, and then the nosi, when he by mistake does an avera of avodah zarah, and a kohen moshiach, an anointed kohen, a kohen gadol, when he does an avera by mistake of the averas of avodah zarah. So these are the 8 different cases where somebody would be doing an avera b'shoigeg, and he has to bring a chatos. And the halachas are very different in these groups. And that's what we're going to discuss here. Because the halacha is that in all these 8 cases, one only ever brings a korban chatos when it's a type, when it's done in a way that had it been done b'mezid, intentionally, it would be chayiv koros. If zdoinei b'koros, then shigagosoi b'chatos. And we're going to have to learn what's the source for that. And somewhere along the line, we're going to see that this word oleha is going to teach us some of these halachas, or one of these halachas. And it happens to be that each one of these 8 brings a very specific type of chatos. We'll just go through it very quickly. A yochid, an individual who does a regular aveira, which is a doinei bekoros, not avodah zarah, he has to bring as a chatos either a seira, which is a female goat, or a kisva, which is a female lamb. If the Rav of Klal Yisrael do it, then due to a mistaken ruling from Beis Din, then they have each tribe, each shevet has to bring a par helam dover, which is a bull, which is a chatos. The Kohen Mashiach has to bring a bull, also a par, and a Nossi has to bring a soir, which is a goat, a he-goat. That's as far as the regular Averis, which are Zedoinei Bekoros. Regarding Avodah Zarah, a Yochid brings a Seira, a female goat. If a Beis Din give a ruling to Klal Yisrael and Rav of Klal Yisrael do Avodah Zarah, they have to actually bring 2 karbonos. They have to bring a bull, a par le'oila, as a carbon oila, and a so'ir, a he-goat, as a chatos. Again, each shevet. A Nossi and a Kohen Mashiach, as with the individual, the regular individual, brings a seira, a female goat, as a chatos. That is these halachas summarized, and now we're going to have to just learn the sources, and according to Rabbi, one of them is going to be from Oleha, and then the Gemara is obviously going to ask, according to the Rabbanon, who need Oleha to tell us a halacha in Hilchas Yibum, as we saw in Daf Gimel Amud Beis, how are they going to learn this halacha of the chatos that we're about to learn now? Let's see this inside. Tanya, Ein Chayovin Beis Din Elo al dover shezedoinei koros ushegigosei chatos. This is the second bracket that we mentioned of the 8, when it's a Beis Din, and they have to bring a par helam dover if they give a mistaken ruling to the tzibur of Klal Yisrael, and most of Klal Yisrael do this avera. They only have to bring this par helam dover. Each shevet only has to bring the par helam dover only if they transgress something that was zedoinei koros, that had they done it intentionally, it would have been punishable by koros, v'shegigosei chatos, and then if they did it by mistake, they have to bring a par helam dover as a chatos. V'chein ha-Mashiach, this Kohen Mashiach, also only brings his bull, his par, as a chatos if he did something that was zedoinei bekoros, and then shegigosei is chatos. V'loi ba'avodas kochovim. Going to the second bracket, the avodah zara averos, then the chatos that they bring there is also elo al dover shechayovin al zedoinei koros v'shegigosei chatos. It's only if what they did to and with the avodah zara, for example, the shechting, the offering up onto the mizbeach, the pouring, the bowing, as Rashi brings here, the zivuach, the kitur, the nisuach, nishtach avoya. However, for example, if somebody embraced, hugged an avodah zara or kissed an avodah zara, that's not punishable by koros, and therefore if somebody did that, he would not bring a korban chatos. Elo al dover shechayovin al zdoinei koros v'shegigosei chatos. Utnan namim, we also learned in the Mishnah in Hoyres, kol mitzvah shebatayra. Any mitzvah, any avera, more accurately, any mitzvahs loisase in the Torah, shechayovin al zdoinei koros, that is punishable by koros if it's done intentionally, v'al shegigosei chatos, and when done by mistake it brings a chatos, then the yochid mevi kisva oy seira, as we already said before, the individual by other averos, not avodah zara, brings either seira or a kisva, either a female goat or a female lamb. Nossi, maybe soyer, the Nossi brings a soyer. Mashiach, the Kohen Mashiach, u Beis Din, or if it's the Beis Din, the par helam dover of the Beis Din, Mavi'in par, they bring a bull. U'ba'avodas kachovim, and if it's Averos of Avodah Zarah, then Yochid, Nossi, v'Mashiach, all 3, either a regular individual, or a Nossi, or a Kohen Mashiach, Mavi'in Seira, they bring a Seira, a female goat. Tzibur, however, if it's the Tzibur that did Avodah Zarah, consequent to a ruling, a mistaken ruling of the Beis Din, then Mavi'in par v'soir, they bring a par la'oila and a soir lechatos. Par la'oila v'soir lechatos. And now the big question, mino hanemili, these 8 halachas we just saw now, what are the source? The Tonu Rabbanon, we learned in a Brisa, again this is in Hoirios. It says in the Pasuk, and this is a Pasuk talking about the Tzibur who do an Aveira because of a mistaken ruling, a regular Aveira, not Avodah Zarah. It says in the Pasuk, V'noida'o hachatos asher chotu oleo, v'hikrivu hakohol par ben bokor lechatos, v'hiviu oisoi lifnei oihel moed. So what does it say here? It says in the Pasuk, asher chotu oleho. It's talking about the Tzibur who did an Aveira, and it says they did an Aveira oleho. And Rabbi Omer, and Rabbi learns, Ne'emar kan oleho, over here regarding the Tzibur who did an Aveira that is a doinei bekoros, it says the word oleho. V'ne'emar lehalon, and elsewhere regarding Yibum, actually not regarding Libum, regarding the Eishes Ach, and Daf Gimel, we connected this oleh with Yibum, but here we see regarding Eishes Ach, V'isha el achoisa lo isikoch litzrei legalois ervosa oleha b'chayeho. That's in the parasha of Aroyos. Ma la'alon, in the same way as there in the parasha of Aroyos. Dovo shechayovin al zdoinei koros v'al shigagosei chatos. We know that Aroyos is something where if one does them intentionally, it's chayiv koros, and by mistake is chatos. Afkan, so to here regarding the tzibur who did an avera, one only chayiv chatos. Kan is a dovo shechayovin al zdoinei koros v'al shigagosei chatos. In the event that the Mazid is chorus, then the shoygig is chatos. Okay, says the Gemara, says the Brisa, Ashkechon Tzibur. So we now know, and this is really the answer of the Gemara. What is Rabbi doing with Oleho by Achois Isha? The answer is he's learning it to teach us that when the Tzibur do an Aveira, which is Zadoinei Bekoros, then Shigagosoi is Bechatos. He learned it from Eishesach, not from Eishesach, from Achois Isha. So Ashkechon Tzibur. Okay, so one of the 8, you've brought me a proof. But Mashiach Minolon, when a Kohen Mashiach, when he does an Aveira, how do you know that his Chatos is only when it's Zadoinei Bekoros? It says in the Pasuk b'Moshiach, regarding the Kohen Mashiach, it says in the Pasuk, V'im HaKohen HaMoshiach Yechto, La'ashmas Ha'om. It says that he does an Aveira, which is La'ashmas Ha'om, a type of sin similar to that of the people, of the public. V'hikrives chatos ha'shechot, he's got to bring his chatos. Par ben boker, he's got to bring a bull. Tomim lashem lechatos. So it says le'ashma sa'om. It means that the punishment or the conditions of this Kohen Mashiach for bringing a chatos is similar to that of the public, of the tzibur. And by the tzibur we already saw, you learned from Oleha, it's only if Zadoinoi Bekoros, then Shigagosei Bechatos. So too, the Kohen Mashiach is only if it's Zadoinoi Bekoros, Shigagosei Bechatos. Says the Gemara, Harei Mashiach Katzibur. So you see from the words, La'ashmas Ha'om, that the Kohen Mashiach has the same bracket as the tzibur. Yochid v'nosi, we still have a regular individual and a nosi. How do we know that they also bring their chatos? The nosi, the so'ir, and the yochid, either the se'ira or the kisva. How do you know that's only if it's something which is a doinei bekoros? Because asya, mitzvahs. In the pasuk of the tzibur, of the Beis Din, it says in the pasuk there, V'im kol adas Yisrael, Yishgu v'ne'elam dova me'eni akol v'osu achas mikol mitzvahs Hashem asher lo yiteosenu v'oshemu. That's another pasuk regarding the tzibur that we spoke about before. And regarding the nosi and the yochid, by the pasuk of the nosi it says v'im nosi yechte v'osu achas mikol mitzvahs Hashem elikov asher lo yiteosenu b'shgogo v'oshem. And regarding the yochid it says in the pasuk v'im nefesh achas sechto b'shgogo me'am ha'oretz ba'asoiso achas mi-mitzvahs Hashem asher lo yiteosenu v'oshem. So by the nosi and the yochid it says mitzvahs. By the tzibur it also says mikol mitzvahs. And the same way as the tzibur we learned before from Oleha, that if Zadoinoi Koros Shigagosei Chatos, then so too the Yochid and the Nosi, we say that if Zadoinoi Koros, only then Shigagosei Bechatos. Says the Gemara, V'loi ba'avoidas kechovim. All that was all regarding the regular krisis, that b'mezid is Koros, b'shoigig is Chatos. But what about avoidas zara? Avoidas kechovim. Also, elu al dover shechayovin al Zadoinoi Koros, v'al Shigagosei Chatos. Again, what would be our source for that? Tzibur ba'avoidas kechovim. So let's start with the tzibur. When Roiv of Klal Yisrael serve Avodah Zarah, which consequent to a mistaken ruling of the Beis Din, then actually we learn it out from me'ene. Let's go back to the tzibur of the regular Averis. The tzibur then, the pasuk we just mentioned, where it says mitzvahs, it also says v'im kol hadas Yisrael yishku v'ne'elam davar me'enei hakohol v'asu achas mikol mitzvahs Hashem ashleisei osenu v'ashemu. It says there by the regular krisis, it says me'enei. And regarding the tzibur who do an avodah zarah, it says v'hoyo im me'enei ha'eda nesasol ishgaga v'asu kol ha'eda parben boko echad la'oila l'reach nichoyach l'Hashem u'minchase v'nizke k'mishpat v'u'seir izim echad lechatos. So it says me'enei in both psukim, so you learn out the tzibur by avodah zarah from the tzibur of the regular averos, that they don't bring the same korban. By regular avera, they bring each tribe, each shevet brings a par. By avodah zarah, it's a par la'oila and a soir lechatos. However, at least you learn from eine that the one is only chayiv to bring the korbanos, the chatos and the oila, only if it's something which is a doinoi bekoros. Yochid, Nosi, Moshiach. What about the other three who do avodah zarah? A Yochid, a Nosi, and a Kohen Moshiach. They learn that out from the pasuk. It says ve'im nefesh achas sechto bishgaka. This is talking about avodah zarah. Nefesh achas, a single person, not the majority of Klal Yisrael. Ve'kriva eiz bas shnosa lechatos. He brings a seira, an eiz bas shnosa. So that's what we learn from this pasuk. Nefesh achas is echad yochid ve'echad nosi ve'echad mashiach. But mashma, any individual. It doesn't matter whether it's a yochid, a regular person, or a nosi, or a kohen mashiach. And says the Gemara, Vov. So that means these three is ve'im nefesh achas echto. But we don't yet know what about this ve'im nefesh achas. It doesn't say here explicitly that you're only chayav if it's a doinei koros. So that's why it says v'im nefesh achas. There's an extra vov moisif al inyan rishon, because this is in pasuk Chov Zayin, where it speaks about a nefesh achas that serves avodah zarah b'shoigig, that he has to bring an eiz bas shnosa lechatos. But what does it say in pasuk Chov Daled a few psukim earlier? There it's talking about avodah zarah of the tzibur, the pasuk we mentioned before. Since the psukim before the Yochid who serves avodah zarah is the tzibur that serves avodah zarah, and the tzibur who serves avodah zarah, we already know that they only have to bring their korban if it's something which is zedoinei bekoros. We learned that out from eine from the regular tzibur who do an avera of which is zedoinei bekoros, and therefore vav moisef alin in rishon v'yilma tachton me'elyon. We learn the halachas of what's written later, which is the yochid who serves avodah zarah, the Yochid, the Nasi, or the Kohen Mashiach. We learn it Mina Elyon from what's written before it, which is the Tzibur that serve avodah zarah. And now the Gemara asks V'Rabbanon, according to the Rabbanon who needed Oleho to teach us a halacha in Hilchas Yibum on Daf Gimel, then how are they going to know these halachas that in these 8 brackets you're only chayev to bring the korban when it's something which is a doinei bekoros? Hai svara minolahu. How do they know that this halacha that we're learning here? And in particular, we're talking here about a regular zedoinei koros, not avodah zarah, who by the tzibur, when the Beis Din misled most of Klal Yisrael to do this avera, that is what the Rabbi learned from Oleho, and the Rabbanon don't have Oleho available. How do they know that only where it's zedoinei bekoros you've got the shigagosoi bechatos? Says the Gemara, Nafkalahu, we learn it out from elsewhere, Midakomakri le Rabbi Yeshua lebrei. When Rabbi Yeshua was reading the following pasuk to his son, and this is the pasuk that we mentioned before regarding avodah zarah. We actually didn't mention this. We mentioned the parasha before. We haven't mentioned this pasuk. This is a couple of psukim after the ones we mentioned in the parasha of avodah zarah. It says there like this: Ha'ezrach b'vnei Yisrael v'lager agar b'soichom Torah achas yelochem. You should have a single Torah la'oise b'shgaga, to somebody who does an avera by mistake. V'hanefesh asher ta'aseh, that's the next pasuk after that, talking about b'mezid. V'hanefesh asher ta'aseh b'yod ramo mino ezroch min ager asher Hashem hu megadif v'nichrosu hanefesh ahi mikerev hamo. If he does it intentionally, then he's chayev koros. So from there you learn from Torah achas yelochem la'oise b'shgaga. we learn from Vanefesh Ashetase Biyad Rama. The pasuk puts these two psukim next to each other. It's Huksha Kol HaTeira Kula LaAvodas Kechovim. That in the same way as Ba'avodas Kechovim, the second of these two psukim, speaking about Mazid, it says explicitly Zadoinoi Bekorus V'nichraso HaNefesh Ahi Mikerev Amo. Ma'avodas kechovim, dovo shechayovin al zdoinei koros ve'al shegegosoi chatos, and then there's a chatos if he does it by mistake, and then it says Torah achas af kol dovo shechayovin al zdoinei koros. So too everywhere else where there's a zdoinei is koros, then ve'al shegegosoi chatos, then when doing it b'shegeg is a chatos. Says the Gemara. So ashkechon yochid. So we can, from this hekesh of Torah Achas, we learn a regular Yochid, and a Nosi, and a Mashiach, bein ba'avodas kechovim, bein b'shar mitzvos. But tzibur ba'avodas kechovim minayin, how do you know that this same thing applies when a tzibur serve avodah zarah? And the basis behind this question is because the psukim that we just mentioned here speak about the nefesh, a single person. So you can say Torah Achas is whenever there's a single person, either Avodah Zarah or other krisis, if it's Yochid, Kohen, Mashiach or Nosi. But when it comes to the Beis Din that mislead the majority of Klal Yisrael, you haven't got this hekesh. So we need to know, how do you know the Beis Din, the Roiv of Klal Yisrael, by regular krisis and by Avodah Zarah? So the Gemara says, Tzibur ba'avodas kechovim minayin, says the Gemara Omakro. Because we saw in the pasuk before, and we actually saw this already before, just the other way around. It says v'im nefesh, and when it speaks about these psukim here, which is talking about a yochid doing avodah zarah, it says v'im nefesh, which is, so to speak, the extra vav, which is a continuation or connection to what it says before. And what does it say before? So here we're talking about, that means before the Gemara mentioned this to learn the Yochid of Avodah Zarah from the Tzibur of Avodah Zarah. Here we're doing it the other way around. We're saying that the Vav that connects the Yochid of Avodah Zarah to the Tzibur of Avodah Zarah actually teaches that the halacha of the Tzibur do Avodah Zarah from the halachas of the Yochid to do Avodah Zarah. And when the Yochid do Avodah Zarah, we said there's Torah Achas. When the Yochid do any Avera that is Doine B'Koros, Shegegose B'Chatos. So for Yilmad Elyon, we learn what it says earlier on regarding the Tzibur to Avodah Zarah, mitachton, from what it says later by the Yechidim who serve Avodah Zarah. Okay, Elot Tzibur b'shar mitzvos minolon. How do you know that any other zadoinoi koros and shigagosei chatos? How do you know that all other places where the tzibur do such an avera only where it's zadoinoi b'koros shigagosei chatos? And this is back to what we saw earlier on in Rabbi. Rabbi said we'll have eine. Just Rabbi learned the tzibur of avodah zarah from the tzibur of a regular avera. And here we're learning the tzibur of a regular avera from the tzibur of avodah zarah, from the same gzeira shava of eine. Says the Gemara, the Rabbi who had a different set of psukim, as we mentioned at the beginning, Hai Torah Achas my Ovidle. What is he going to do with this pasuk that it says in the parasha of the Yochid who serves avodah zarah, that Torah Achas, there's a single ruling for all of it, one Torah, my Ovidle, what's he going to learn with it? The Rabbanon learned from there that all the Yechidim who ever do any Zadoine B'Koros, they bring Shigagosei Chatos. But Rabbi learns that from elsewhere. What's he doing with Torah Achas? Answers the Gemara, Miboile Lekiditanya. This is to teach us something which we learn a brisa again in Horius. Lefi shemotzinu, shechilei kakosov bein Yechidim lemurubim. We find in Hilchas Avodah Zarah there's a difference between individuals and many. And this is not to be confused with the tzibur. Till now we've mentioned tzibur, which is the majority of Klal Yisrael. Here we're not talking about the majority of Klal Yisrael, we're talking about a town. If a whole town did an Aveira, like Avodah Zarah, which is punishable by Koros, is there any difference between a single person and many people in a town? So the Brisa says we do find there is a difference between an individual that serves Avodah Zarah and a city that serves Avodah Zarah, which we know as an Ir Hanidachas. That Yechidim Beskila, an individual person who serves Avodah Zarah, if there's Edim and Hasra, he'll be punishable by Skila. Lefikach Mamoinon Polat, and therefore the money doesn't get destroyed, the possessions of those people don't get destroyed. They survive, so to speak. But Merubin, but when you have many people, when you have a city, an Ir Anidachas, B'Sayif, they get punished by Sayif, which is a lighter type of death sentence, and Lefikach Mamoinon Ovad, and therefore their money, their possessions also get destroyed. So since we find that there is such a difference between an individual and a city, not a majority of Klal Yisrael, but a city who do Avodah Zarah. So Yochel, I may have thought also Nachlik b'Korban Esem, that they should have a unique korban, a korban that doesn't apply anywhere else. Talmud Lema, that's why we have a pasuk that tells us Torah achas yeh lochem, that it doesn't matter whether it's an individual or whether it's a whole city. As far as the korban is concerned, it's the same korban that they bring a seira like a yochid does. Maskef lo Rav Chilkiah Mehagrunya. Rav Chilkiah Mehagrunya asks a question on this. Why would you have entertained the idea that if a city, many people, a rabbi, many people do Avodah Zarah, that they should bring a different korban? We actually, and if not for the pasuk of Torah Achas, Tama de Kosav Rachmana Torah Achas Yelochem, it's only because the Torah says Torah Achas Yelochem that they bring the same korban as a yochid. Holav Hochi, but if you wouldn't have that pasuk, Hava Amina Nechlak, I may have thought that in the same way as they have different halachas regarding the death sentence and different halachas regarding what happens to the money, maybe they have a different korban. Well, and that's why you need the pasuk, My night Laisu. Well, what other korban would you want to bring? What other korban could you bring that would be unique to a tzibur, to a majority, to many people, to a rabbim in a city? Are you going to say Laisa Par? They should bring a bull, not like a yochid who brings a seira, but rather bring a bull. That wouldn't be unique to them. Tzibur b'shar mitzvah, it's hu demaisi. A regular rabbim who bring who by mistake do an avera which is punishable by chorus, as we saw before, they bring a par helam dover. So if they had to if this city that served Avodah Zarah would have to bring a bull, it wouldn't be unique to them. Kisva, you're going to say they should bring a female goat? Yochid b'shar mitzvahs hu demaisi. Well, a yochid by a regular Zadoinei b'chorus brings a seira. Sa'ir, you're going to say should bring a male goat? Nosi b'shar mitzvahs hu demaisi. Well, that's what Nosi, when doing a regular Zadoinei b'chorus, shigagosai bring chatos. What's the chatos? It's a sa'ir. Par la'oila v'sa'ir l'chatos, you're going to say that if the city do Avodah Zarah, they should bring a bull as an oila and a sa'ir for a chatos. Tzibur b'avodas kechavim hu demaisi. That also wouldn't be unique to them, because when the tzibur and rave of Klal Yisrael by Avodah Zarah, that's what they have to bring. Ve'elomai, what are you going to say? Seira, that they should bring a seira, which is a female goat. Yochid nami hainu korbono. We said before, yochid who does an avera, which is a dainei chorus, brings either a seira or a kizva. So, since there is no korban, there is no possibility of a korban that would be unique to them, so obviously they don't bring a unique korban, so why do I need Torah Achas to say they don't bring a unique korban? Says the Gemara Yitzchok, no. Even though all the other options have been exhausted elsewhere, still we need Torah Achas. I may have thought, when the tzibur, when Rov of Klal Yisrael get misled by Avodah Zarah, by a ruling of Beis Din, they bring maisi, they bring a parla oila v'soy lechatos, they bring a bull as an oila and a goat as a chatos, in who maybe this city that serves Avodah Zarah, namin naisu ibcha, they'll bring a par and a soir, but they'll do it the other way around. The par will be a chatos, and the soir will be an oila. Inami or tzorich. Indeed, without the Torah Achas, we would assume that they need a unique korban, and since there is no unique korban, ve'enoi takana, so they don't bring any korban, and they actually do not get atoned. Kumash malon, that's why I would need Torah Achas to say no. None of those suggestions pass, and they have Torah Achas, they bring the same korban that the individual has to bring a seira, even if it's a whole city that disserved Avodah Zarah. Continues the Gemara, and now the Gemara is taking us back to the Mishnah. What did we see in our Mishnah, the beginning of the Perek? That there are 15 different types of arroyos, that if Shimon dies and was married and had 2 wives, and one of them was an erva, one of the 15 arroyos to Reuven, even though the mitzvah of Yibum says Reuven should marry Shimon's widow if Shimon died without children, since one of his wives are an erva, he doesn't do yibum, and not only he doesn't do yibum to the erva, he also doesn't do yibum to the tzara, to any other wife that Shimon was married to when he died. He doesn't do yibum either with Reuven. And the Mishnah singled out that there were 15. Omar le Levi le Rabbi. Levi said to Rabbi, "My area de toni tesvov. Why do you just mention 15? Listener tezayin. There's a 16th one. There's another erva, another situation, a case not mentioned in the Mishnah, that Shimon would be married to somebody that is an erva to Reuven, and Reuven cannot do yibum with that erva." Omar le. So Rabbi answered back to Levi, somebody who's got a brain that's working sharply wouldn't be asking such a question. What are you suggesting? What's your 16th? Says Rabbi, I know what your 16th was. It's surely Imoy Anusas Oviv. And the case goes as follows. Yaakov was married to Rachel and had a child called Shimon. All fine and good. At some point, Yaakov, he had relations, ba'oinus, forced relations with Leah. And Leah gave birth to Yaakov, gave birth, consequent to that, to Reuven. And Shimon went and married Leah. Shimon, who was Yaakov's son, married the woman that Yaakov was ma'anas, had forced relations with. So Shimon married Leah, and he also had another wife called Sarah. That's called Anusas Oviv. But what happened then? Shimon died without children. So who does Yibum? Shimon's brother from the same father. Who would that be? That would be that Reuven, who's a son of Yaakov no less than Shimon. Just Shimon was born from a regular marriage between Yaakov and Rachel. Then Reuven was born from an oinus of Yaakov and Leah. So now Reuven has to do Yibum to Shimon's wife. But who was Shimon's wife? It was Anusas Oviv. It was this woman, Leah, who happens to be Reuven's mother. So here you've got a case where it's not his mother through marriage, it's a mother through oinus, and he's now the woman that he would have to do Yibum with is his mother through oinus. And here Reuven is not allowed to marry his mother through oinus that was married to Shimon, or to the tzara, or to any other wife of Shimon. Why is that case not mentioned in the Mishnah? Says that, so that's what Rabbi said to Levi. Imoy anusas oviv. That's surely you're asking why that's not mentioned in the Mishnah, and I'll tell you why. Imoy anusas oviv plukta Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanon. We're going to see later on Daf Tzadik Zayin that it's actually a machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, Shimon is actually not allowed to marry Anusas Oviv. The whole situation wouldn't start because Shimon, who was Yaakov's son, is not allowed to marry the woman that Yaakov had forced relations with. That was Ma'anas, that woman. Shimon's not allowed to marry her. If Shimon's not allowed to marry her, then there's no case of Yibum. It would never be that Shimon dies and his brother Reuven would have to do Yibum with his mother Anusas Oviv. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, this case could never happen. Our Mishnah is not bringing any cases which are dependent on a machlekas. They're only bringing cases which everybody agrees with. And therefore, that's what Rabbi said to Levi. There's no question why Rabbi in the Mishnah didn't mention a 16th. Says the Gemara V'loi, are you so sure that the Mishnayos are not mentioning any cases where it's actually a machlekas? V'harei isur mitzvah, v'isur kedusha. And these are cases we're going to learn about later on Daf Chof, that either Isur Mitzvah, which means that when Shimon dies and Reuven has to do Yibum, then Shimon's wife was either an Isur Mitzvah to Reuven, which means a Derabonon, a type of Erva which is Miderabonon, or V'Isur Kedusha, or a type of Erva which is only Osir as a lav, it's not an Erva of Chorus. And it's mentioned in the Mishnah later on Daf Chof, the pligi Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbanon. It's actually machleikas Rabbi Akiva and Rabbanon. According to the Rabbanon, you do chalitza, but you cannot do yibum, but you can do chalitza. You have to do chalitza. According to Rabbi Akiva, it's similar to regular erva, and you don't even do chalitza. Uktonya, nonetheless, it's mentioned in the Mishnah on Daf Chof Amud Aleph. So how are you saying that the Mishnayos are only mentioning cases which are not dependent on an argument? Well, over there on Daf Chof it is. Answers the Gemara b'Pirkin Komrinon. We're only talking about in this Pirik. In the first Pirik of Yevamos, the cases mentioned are not those that are dependent on a machlokes. Daf Chof is already the second Pirik. In the second Pirik, we don't mind mentioning things that have a machlokes. Says the Gemara, okay, but I've got another question against Rabbi. Let's take the Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. It says in Daf Yud Gimel, Beis Shammai matirin esat tzoros le'achin. This whole concept we've been learning about, that when when Shimon's wife is an erva to Reuven, the Reuven, not only can he not do yibum to the erva, he also cannot do yibum to any other wife of Shimon. That's only Beis Hillel's opinion. Beis Shammai say there's no concept of an esat tzoros, and Reuven can do yibum with the other wife of Shimon. Beis Shammai matirin esat tzoros le'achin, or Beis Hillel oisrin. It's only Beis Hillel who say it's asa, and it's mentioned in our Mishnah. The Mishnah says that the tzoros don't do yibum. Answers the Gemara, Beis Shammai bimkom Beis Hillel eino Mishnah. When it comes to machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, it's so clear that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, not like Beis Shammai. It's not considered a case which is questionable, a case which is debatable, a case which is arguable. No, it's crystal clear like Beis Hillel, and therefore we have no issue mentioning it. Says the Gemara, but there's another case that we mentioned on Daf Beis Amud Beis in the Mishnah, and this was actually a case, erva number 14 in the Mishnah. What happens when you've got a case of Eishes Ochiv Sheloi Hoyo Ba'ilamai? What's that? So we already explained this when we learned the Mishnah. We'll explain it quickly again. Reuven and Shimon are two brothers, and Reuven married Sarah. All that is fine. Reuven died without children, and now this Sarah, there's a mitzvah to do yibum with Shimon. And Shimon then did yibum with Sarah, which the widow of Reuven, Shimon did yibum. That's fine. And now Levi was born. Levi was now born, and this Sarah is who was originally the wife of Reuven, but when Reuven, all the while, the whole lifetime of Reuven, Levi wasn't even born yet. And then now she's married to Shimon, and Shimon dies now without children. Is Levi allowed to do yibum to Sarah? So now Shimon dies without children. So now there's a discussion that this Sarah is actually a woman who, that means this Levi is actually born after Reuven died. So this wife of Reuven, the original wife of Reuven, this Sarah, who happens now to be married to Shimon, but she was the wife of Reuven when Reuven, his life, including his death, his whole lifetime, was there before Levi was born. So this Sarah, relative to Levi, is considered an Eishes Ochiv Sheloi Hoyo Ba'ilamai. So is Levi now allowed to do yibum to this Sarah when Shimon dies without children? So we saw in our Mishnah, it's one of the arayos. Ki yeshu achim yachtov. You're only allowed to do yibum if you were alive when the brother that died, when that brother was alive at the same time. But if the brother is born after the first brother dies, then they were never alive together, and then there's no heta of yibum. So here you've got a Sarah. So according to the Tana of our Mishnah, the Chachomim in our Mishnah, since this Sarah was the wife of Reuven, and Reuven died before Levi is born, so this Sarah always retains the Issa of Eishesach, and Levi is never allowed to marry the wife of Reuven, even though now she's only has to do yibum to Levi because she was the wife of Shimon, who did yibum when Reuven died. It doesn't matter, says the Rabbanon. Since Levi and Reuven were never alive at the same time, and since this Sarah was the wife of Reuven, it's called Eishes Ach, and Eishes Ach Sheloi Hoyo Ba'ilamai, you're not allowed to marry her. That's the Rabbanon. However, we're going to see later on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, Reb Shimon's going to argue with this. Reb Shimon's going to say, no. In this case, then Levi is allowed to do yibum to Sarah because the yibum is because of Shimon died, and Shimon and Levi were alive at the same time. The fact that before Shimon married this Sarah, she was married to Reuven, and Reuven died before Levi was born, according to Reb Shimon, that doesn't bother us. So here you've got a case, the pligi Reb Shimon v'Rabbanon, Uktani, the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Beis brings this erva, even though it seems to be dependent on a machlokes of Shimon and the Rabbanon. So how can you, Rabbi, say that the Mishnah doesn't bring anything which is a machlokes, and that's why imoy anusas oviv is not mentioned? Why is it different to eishes ach shelo hoyo beilamoy? Answers the Gemara that there's a fundamental difference between two similar cases. And Reb Shimon only argues with one and not with the other. With the case that we mentioned before, indeed Reb Shimon says that Levi is allowed to do Yibum with Sarah. Why? Because Levi was born after Sarah and Shimon were married. Sarah was married to Reuven. Reuven died, and Shimon did Yibum to this Sarah, and only then Levi was born. In that case, indeed, Reb Shimon says, the fact that Sarah was once married to Reuven, so what? When Levi was born, this Sarah was already married to Shimon. Now Shimon dies without children. Levi can do Yibum. However, what happens if Reuven dies before Levi is born? His wife Sarah has to do Yibum to one of Reuven's brothers. He's only got one brother, Shimon. But what happens if before Shimon does Yibum, Levi is born? Now this woman could theoretically should do Yibum with either Shimon or Levi. So here Reb Shimon agrees that since Reuven and Levi were not alive at the same time, and at this point in time, Sarah is now a widow of Reuven and is not yet done Yibum with Shimon, so now this woman can do Yibum to either Shimon or Levi, but she cannot do Yibum with Levi, consequent to Reuven passing away, because Reuven and Levi were not alive at the same time. So once there's a situation where Sarah's not allowed to do Yibum with Levi, because Levi was born after Reuven died, then even if Shimon does Yibum with Sarah, and then Shimon dies, in that case the Reb Shimon agrees Levi cannot do Yibum anymore with this Sarah. Because there was a point in time where this Sarah needed to do Yibum and was not allowed to do Yibum with Levi, because Levi was born after Reuven died. However, in a case where Levi was only born after Shimon did Yibum with Sarah, in that case there was never a moment in time where Sarah needed to do Yibum and could not do Yibum with Levi, because Levi was only born after Shimon already did Yibum. So that's where the Reb Shimon argues with the Chachamim and says in that case, when Shimon dies, since Shimon and Levi were alive at the same time, Levi can do Yibum. So the Gemara answers, in the case where Levi was born before Shimon did Yibum to Reuven's widow, loy palig Reb Shimon. In that case, Reb Shimon agrees to the Rabbanon that Levi will never be able to marry Sarah, the widow of Reuven, and later the widow of Shimon. Levi can never marry her. And since there's a case of eishes ach shelo hoyo beilamoy, that Reb Shimon agrees to the Rabbanon that Levi cannot do Yibum, therefore in this particular case, it's across the board, and therefore the Mishnah could mention it. Asks the Gemara, Va'omer Rabbi Yishia, did Rabbi Yishia not argue with what we just said now? Choluk hoyer Reb Shimon, and says Reb Shimon allows Levi to do Yibum to Sarah af b'rishoina. Even in the first Mishnah in Perek Beis, did we not say there that in a case where even if it's noilad ulebasayif yibim, even in a case where Levi was born before Shimon did Yibum, noilad ulebasayif yibum, even there Reb Shimon says is no problem. In which case, we don't have any case of eishes ach shelo hoyo beilamoy that Reb Shimon says is a problem, and the question comes back, why is the Mishnah mentioning an erva, which is only Rabbanon, not Reb Shimon, if Rabbi said that skin on the Mishnah is not mentioning anything which is dependent on a machlokes? Says the Gemara, don't worry about Rabbi Yishia in this case. Hoi toisiv Rabbi Yishia, we're going to see later on Daf Yotes that this opinion of Rabbi Yishia is going to be refuted, and therefore the conclusion is going to be that Reb Shimon holds that if noilad and lebasayif yibim, then if Levi was born before Shimon did Yibum to Reuven's almona, to Reuven's widow, then even Reb Shimon agrees that it's called eishes ach shelo hoyo beilamoy, and Levi can never do Yibum with Reuven's widow, even if the Shimon marries that widow and then Shimon dies without children, Levi can still not do Yibum. Asks the Gemara, and now the Gemara is going to ask another question, and by the time we get to the end of the Omid, we're going to see another opinion that seems to be a Mishnah that holds, or an opinion that holds that, or quotes an erva, even though it's dependent on a machlokes. And Rabbi said that the Mishnayos are not talking about any aroyas which are dependent on a machlokes, because if they would be mentioning aroyas that are dependent on a machlekes, then imoy anusas oviv should be mentioned. And that's going to be the next question of the Gemara. There's a slight issue here, and the Rashash asks this, that the question is actually from a Mishnah at the beginning of the second perek, and we already said that in the second perek we're not so worried about quoting cases that are dependent on a machlekes, but the Gemara is, either way, the Gemara is asking the question. V'ha'omar of Yehuda Marav, v'chein toni Reb Chia. And this is actually a Mishnah on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph. It's based on a Mishnah on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph. And we'll try and make it simple. What happens if you have a case of two brothers that were married to two sisters? And there were four brothers. There was Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Reuven and Shimon were married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah. We don't have any problem with that. When Reuven dies without children, then Levi can do Yibum to Reuven's wife, Rachel, or Yehuda can do Yibum with Reuven's wife, Rachel. There's no problem with that. What happens now if Reuven and Shimon both died without children, before anyone did any Yibum, and now we have two sisters, Rachel and Leah, who both are widows that need to do Yibum, to Levi and to Yehuda. The problem is that two sisters, you can't marry two sisters. So Minat Torah, we would say, marry one of them. Do Yibum with one of them, and that's it. Or maybe one brother can do Yibum to one brother can do Yibum to the other, and that's fine. However, the fact that both of them, there's a zika to both, that means Levi has now two sisters with which to choose who to do Yibum with, and Yehuda has two sisters with who to choose to do Yibum with. Now we have a problem. It's called Achois Zekukosoi, and it's similar to Achois Isha. Similar to Achois Isha B'chayel, because Levi, the fact that there's a zika, that there's a reason, something that's binding Levi with both Rachel and Leah, because Levi is a surviving brother of Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven and Shimon's wives, Rachel and Leah, are two sisters. So now Levi is somewhat bound to two sisters. That's similar to Achois Isha. That's a problem. So the halacha is, in that case, that Levi is not allowed to do Yibum to Rachel or to Leah, and nor can Yehuda do Yibum to either Rachel or to Leah. But since Minat Torah they could really do Yibum, and therefore we don't allow them to do Yibum, but they have to do Chalitza. And that is the case because there's a Zika there. They have to do Chalitza. So Levi does Chalitza with one of them, and Yehuda does Chalitza with the other one, and that is the halacha. When you've got two brothers who are married to two sisters, the two brothers died, now the remaining two brothers and the two widows, which are sisters, they cannot do Yibum, they do Chalitza. Why? Because each one of the two sisters are both Nofal LeYibum, as it's called. They are both Zokuk to Levi, and both Zokuk to, they both have some connection to Levi and some connection to Yehuda, because they are the two surviving brothers of Reuven and Shimon, and that's an issue. But now what's going to happen if one of these two sisters, let's take Rachel for example, if Rachel happens to be one of the aroyos mentioned on Daf Beis to Levi, which means that for whatever reason Rachel cannot in any way do Yibum to Levi, which means that there's only one woman which actually has a zika, has some binding, some connection to Levi, and it's not Rachel. It's going to be Leah. It's not Rachel, Reuven's wife, it's Leah, Shimon's wife. This is not an issue of tzoros, because they weren't married to the same husband. So in that case, says the Mishnah, that if one of the two sisters was an erva to Levi, then Levi is the only woman that has a zika to Levi is the one that's not an erva, which is Leah. So Levi can do Yibum to Leah. Yehuda, however, Yehuda, who is not an erva to either of these two women, he cannot do Yibum to either, because both of them are Achois Zukukosei. So it says in the Mishnah on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph that Ha'asura lezeh muteres lezeh, v'asura lezeh muteres lezeh, v'achoisa shehi yavimta chiletzes oimes yabemes. In a case where Rachel is an erva to Levi and Leah is an erva to Yehuda, in that case Rachel is got no connection whatsoever to Levi. Levi can do Yibum with Leah. Leah, who's an erva to Yehuda, will have no connection to Yehuda, so Yehuda can do Yibum with Rachel. And that's what it means, that Achaysa Sheyevimta, the sister of the one who's an erva, is, if it's in the context of Yibum, is Chiletzes Oimis Yabemes. You can do Chalitza, but you can even do Yibum. The only time you cannot do Yibum is if both of them would come into question, which means that neither sister is an erva. But if one of the sisters is an erva, then the other sister, there's no problem of doing Yibum to the husband who is an erva to the other sister. That's what it says in the Mishnah of Chavav Amud Aleph. Now, Rav and Reb Chia said that, added on a few words, Bekulon ani koire bohen, that this case on the Mishnah of Chavav Amud Aleph applies if Rachel is an erva to Levi. It's all 15 aroyas mentioned in the first Mishnah. We'll soon see if it's all of them. But Bekulon, the 15 aroyas mentioned in the first Mishnah of the Masechet on Daf Beis, if Rachel is that erva to Levi, then Rachel has no connection to Levi in the context of Yibum. So Rachel's sister, Leah, who was Shimon's wife, can do Yibum to Levi. That is what Rav and Reb Chia said. That this halacha, that if Rachel is an erva to Levi, applies to the aroyas mentioned on Daf Beis Amud Aleph. And now we're going to have three different opinions as to what extent the cases in the Mishnah, the aroyas in the Mishnah on Daf Tezvav Amud Aleph, on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, could apply to this case. Because we need to find, and that's why you can see here a very long Rashi, we need to find an ingenious type of cases where you've got two sisters married to two brothers, and these two sisters, that means, like we said, Rachel is married to Reuven, Leah is married to Shimon, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda are brothers, Rachel and Leah are brothers. We have to find a case where Rachel is an erva to Levi and Leah is an erva to Yehuda. In all 15 cases, all 15 types of ervas. That's not going to be an easy feat, and we're not going to discuss all of them. We're only going to discuss those that we need here. So there's going to be three opinions. Rav Yehuda explains that Rav and Reb Chia said, that the Mishnah who says that when you've got Asura lezeh muteres lezeh, Asura lezeh muteres lezeh, that if Rachel is an erva to Levi, Rachel can do Yibum to Yehuda, and if Leah is an erva to Yehuda, then Leah can do Yibum to Levi. Or more accurately, if Rachel is an erva to Levi, Levi can do Yibum with Leah. And if Leah is an erva to Yehuda, Yehuda can do Yibum with Rachel. So Rav Yehuda says it's not all 15. It's only Michamoisoi va'elech. It's only from number 7. And we'll just discuss the case of Chamoisoi va'elech. What would the case be? The case is like this. Rachel and Leah are two sisters. Again, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda are 4 brothers. Rachel and Leah are 2 sisters. Rachel had a daughter called Sarah, and Leah had a daughter called Rivka. So Sarah and Rivka are now first cousins. Their 2 mothers are sisters. What happened then? What happened then was that Sarah, one of the cousins, married Reuven, and the Rivka, the other cousin, married Shimon. That's all fine. Levi then went and married Rachel, who was Reuven's mother-in-law, one of those 2 sisters. Yehuda went and married Leah, who was Shimon's mother-in-law, the one of those 2 sisters. And now Yehuda and Levi both died. So here we've got Reuven and Shimon surviving. They were married to the 2 cousins, Sarah and Rivka. So Reuven now and Shimon both have to do Yibum with Rachel and Leah, who are the widows of Levi and Yehuda. And what happened was that, so what the situation now is that Reuven, he cannot do Yibum to Rachel, one of the 2 sisters, because it's his mother-in-law. Shimon cannot do Yibum with Leah because it's his mother-in-law. So since Leah and Shimon are an erva, mentioned in our Mishnah, Reuven and Rachel are an erva, in which case Reuven can only do Yibum. There's only a zika of Yibum from Reuven to Leah and Shimon to Rachel. So you've got a case of 2 brothers and 2 sisters who need to do Yibum, and we say that it's not a choizuku kosoi, because each woman is can only do Yibum with one of the 2 brothers, because she is a mother-in-law to the other brother. In that case, you've got muteres lezeh, asura lezeh, muteres lezeh. Rachel, who's also to Reuven, it's his mother-in-law, is mutter to Shimon. Leah, that's also to Shimon, it's his mother-in-law, is mutter to Reuven. So Reuven can do Yibum with Leah, and Shimon does Yibum with Rachel. And that's an example of the mother-in-laws, and if you want to go through the long Rashi or open up some sefer with the diagrams here, and it'll be easier. I don't want to confuse you all trying to explain by heart how all these cases work, but that's just an example from here, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. From the case of the mother-in-law and down in the Mishnah, this is possible. However, the first 6, even though 5 of the 6 you could also make some story out of it. However, the first one, because all the first 6, you'll remember, is bitoi, bas benoi, bas ishtoi, bas beno, and bas bitoi. It's all associated to the daughter. The first one being the daughter. If Shimon was married to Reuven's daughter, and then Shimon dies and doesn't have children, Reuven cannot do Yibum with his daughter. That's the first erva mentioned in the Mishnah. And Rav Yehuda here says that Bitoi, for example, is not possible you'll never have a case of 2 brothers marrying 2 sisters, and the 2 sisters are a daughter of the 2 brothers. You're never going to have that case of one sister being a daughter of one brother, the other sister being a daughter of the other brother. You can't have such a case. And since bitoi is not possible to have such a case, therefore, this that Rav and Rabbi Chia said, that this concept of asura lezeh, muteres lezeh, applies to that royas in our Mishnah. It's only from chamoisoi, from the mother-in-law and on, but in bitoi, it wouldn't apply. However, this is not completely accurate. And let's try and understand why. Let's take a case of oinus, where somebody had forced relations with a woman. And let's see what that case would be. So you've got Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, who are 4 brothers. Reuven then was ma'anas. He had forced relations with Sarah and had a daughter called Rachel. So this Rachel is a daughter of Reuven and a daughter of Sarah. Afterwards, Shimon came and had forced relations with the same Sarah, and they had a daughter called Leah. So now you've got the same mother, Sarah, who's got a daughter, Rachel, from Reuven, and a daughter, Leah, from Shimon. Now, Levi married Rachel. Levi married this girl that was born from a forced relations between his brother Reuven and Sarah. Yehuda went and married the Leah, who was born from this forced relations between Shimon, his brother, and the same Sarah, the same mother. And then Levi and Yehuda both died. Their wives, Rachel and Leah, now have to do Yibum with Reuven and Shimon. Problem is that Rachel, Levi's wife, is actually a daughter of Reuven. Leah, which is Yehuda's wife, is a daughter of Shimon. See, here we do have a case of 2 brothers, Reuven and Shimon, who need to do Yibum to 2 sisters. They share the same mother. Rachel and Leah both are daughters of Sarah. And this is a case that theoretically could have happened, and it would apply to say that since Reuven cannot do Yibum with Levi's wife Rachel because it's his daughter, then Reuven can do Yibum with Leah. And because it's not Achay Zukuk Osoi, because Rachel is not Zokuk, is not able to do Yibum with Reuven. And the same with Leah, who cannot do Yibum with Shimon because it's his daughter, so then Shimon can do Yibum with Rachel. So this could really apply, but only when these 2 sisters are sharing the same mother with oinus, when there was forced relations, when it was outside of marriage. However, if it was in marriage, if Reuven married Sarah and then had Rachel, you would never have a case that Shimon would be able to marry that same Sarah. Even if Reuven divorced her, wouldn't be able to marry that same Sarah and have a daughter Leah, because the halacha is that Shimon is not allowed to marry his brother's wife in marriage, if she was married, even after she gets divorced. Achos isha, is osur b'chayah. There's just no case in the world that within marriage you can have 2 sisters who would be able to be in this concept of Yibum to 2 brothers. It just cannot happen. So that's what Rav Yehuda says, that aval shita bava dereisha loy. In the 6 cases, which are all consequent of the concept of bitoi of a daughter, even though the others could really have applied, but the main one of these 6, being the bitoi, that you cannot have a case of asura lezeh, muteres lezeh. Ma'itama, why not? Given the bitoi, In the case of bitoy, bo'insin mishkachas. In the case of forced relations outside of marriage, you can have two sisters that are noifel leyibum to two brothers. But b'nesuin, but in marriage, lo mishkachas lo. It's not possible. And since you cannot have it in marriage, b'nesuin kamairi, the Mishnah is talking about, that means the Mishnah of asura lezeh muteres lezeh and asura lezeh muteres lezeh is talking about within the two sisters are sisters within marriage. Bo'insin lo kamairi, they're not talking about sisters from oinus. And therefore, according to Rav Yehuda, this that Rav and Reb Chia said, that when the Mishnah says asura lezeh muteres lezeh, even to do yibum, and they said bekulon anikayra behen is talking about the types of aroyas in the Mishnah on Daf Beis. It's not talking about bitoy. It's only talking about from chamoisoi ve'elach. However, Abaya says no. Metargim, he explains that this that Rav and Reb Chia said bekulon anikayra behen af bitoy me'anusosoi. The same could apply by bitoy. It's true that it's from oinus. In the case of oinus, you can have two sisters who are noifel leyibum to two brothers, but each one is an erev of bitoy to the other brother, and therefore each brother can do yibum to the other sister. At the end of the day, it's a case which we find that it's asura lezeh, muteres lezeh. Iboyim eno insin, to have a, iboyim eno nesuin, to have a. What's the difference if it's a case that's through nesuin, through marriage, or not through marriage? It's possible to have bitoy. However, says Abaya, there is a case in the Mishnah, in our Mishnah on Daf Beis, that would not apply to that Mishnah in Daf Chavov. Aval eishes ochiv shelo hoyo ba'ilomoy loy. In the case of eishes ochiv shelo hoyo ba'ilomoy, that Rav and Rav Chia they would not have meant that one as well. Because you cannot have a case of two sisters, and two sisters who are noifel leyibum, because they were married to two of the four brothers, and they died without children. So you've got two sisters who now noifel leyibum to two of the surviving brothers, and that it's not achayzu kukasoi, because each one of these sisters is an eishes ochiv sheloi haya beilomoy to another brother. That could not happen unless you hold of Reb Shimon. It's only possible according to Reb Shimon. We mentioned Reb Shimon at the beginning of the Amud. We're going to explain the example in a moment. But according to the Rabbanon, who they say that any eishes ach shelo hoya beilomoy, you can never do yibum. It doesn't matter when this new brother was born. He can never do yibum with a wife that was ever a wife with any brother that was not alive at the same time as him. So according to the Rabbanon, lo mishkachas lo, you would never have two sisters and two brothers where one sister is eishes ach shelo hoya beilomoy to one of the brothers and the other brother to the other sister. And beplukta lo kamayri. And in the Mishnah is not talking about machloikus. And since it's dependent on Reb Shimon and the Chachomim, we don't mention it. And before we explain what the case is, Rav Safra is the third opinion. He says, Metargim af eishes achiv. He says, even eishes achiv shelo hoya ba'ilomoy, Rav and Rav Chia meant that as well. Or mishkachas lo b'shita achin, and there is a case of when you actually need 6 brothers for this case to happen. We're going to explain it in a moment. And indeed, valibud Reb Shimon. And you're right, it only works according to Reb Shimon. V'simonechon, you want to remember the case which we're about to explain. It's meis, noilad, v'yibim, meis, noilad, v'yibim. That's the sequence. Death, a birth, a yibum, a death, a birth, and yibum. In that case, according to Reb Shimon, you can have 2 sisters and 2 brothers, where one brother and one of the sisters is eishes ach shelo hoya beilomoy, and the other one to the other sister. And therefore, even in this case, according to Reb Shimon, you could have asura lezeh, muteres lezeh. So we see from here, from Rav Safra, that Mishnah on Daf Chavov Amud Aleph is, according to Rav Safra, and Rav Safra's explanation of Rav and Reb Chia, Reb Chia was a Talmud of Rabbi, is incorporating even a case which is a machloikus. And it only works according to the opinion of Reb Shimon. And this is contrary to what Rabbi said before, that in the Mishnayos here, we're only mentioning those aroyos which are, everybody agrees with, not if it's a machloikus. Elo. Says the Gemara, Rebbe Hana Kloli Lesle. It must be that Rebbe, who said that we do not mention any aroyas which are dependent on a machleikus, he would argue with what Reb Chia and with what Rav said, that according to Rav Safra's understanding of Rav and Reb Chia, that B'kulon ani kaira behen, the Rabbi says even Eishes Ach Shelo Hoya Be'ilomoy could be a case that the Mishnah on Daf Chavav Asura Lezeh Muteres Lezeh could apply, and Rabbi will disagree with that, and he'll say that the Mishnah of Asura Lezeh Muteres Lezeh is not including Eishes Ach Shelo Hoya Be'ilomoy, and then the Gemara carries on with some other explanations to explain Rabbi, which we're going to learn that in the next shiur. And now, just to understand what's going on here, what's the case that you've got Eishes Ach Shelo Hoya Be'ilomoy, that according to Reb Shimon, you could have Asura Lezeh Muteres Lezeh and Asura Lezeh Muteres Lezeh in the sequence of Meis Noilad V'Yibim, Meis Noilad V'Yibum, and the case goes as follows. And as the Gemara said, it's going to involve 6 brothers. And in all the cases we've seen till now, there's at least 4 brothers, because 2 are married to 2 sisters, and then the 2 brothers die, and the other 2 have to do Yibum. Here we're going to have a more complicated case. We've got Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda are 4 brothers. Rachel and Leah are 2 sisters. Reuven married Rachel, and Shimon married Leah. So far, so good. Now Reuven died without children. His wife Rachel is now Nofal Yibum, has to do Yibum with one of the surviving brothers, either Shimon or Levi or Yehuda. But before that, before anyone could do Yibum, Yitzchok was born. Yitzchok was born, and now this Rachel, who was Nofal Yibum, it was Reuven's wife, but Reuven died before Yitzchok was born, so that we've already learned. Everybody's going to agree in this case that Rachel is also to Yitzchok. Yitzchok is never going to be able to do Yibum. It's Eishes Ach Shelo Hoya Be'ilomoy. According to everybody's going to agree with that. So now you've got Rachel, Reuven's wife, who cannot do Yibum with Yitzchok. But any of the other brothers, Levi and Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, who were alive when Reuven was alive, they can do Yibum to Reuven's widow, to Rachel. So what happened is that Levi did Yibum to Rachel, Reuven's widow. And then what happened next? Shimon, who was a husband of Leah, the other sister, Shimon died without children. Now Leah, who's a sister of Rachel, and in the meantime Rachel is a wife of Levi who did Yibum because Reuven died without children. So now Shimon died, and Leah, one of the other siblings, have to do. Reuven's not alive anymore. Levi is married to Rachel, a sister of Leah. He can't do Yibum. Shimon, who was married to Leah, has just died. Either Yehuda can do Yibum with Leah, or Yisachar can do Yibum with Leah, because Yisachar was alive together with Shimon. He couldn't do Yibum to Rachel, Reuven's wife, because he was born after Reuven died, but he was alive with Shimon. Either Yehuda or Yisachar could do Yibum with Leah. But before any of them did Yibum, what happened was, Zvulun, a 6th brother, was born. And now this Zvulun really is one of the brothers who theoretically could do Yibum with Leah, because Shimon died without children, leaving over Leah, and one of the brothers can do Yibum. However, everybody agrees here that this Leah, this Zvulun, was born before anyone did Yibum with Leah. This Leah is also to him because of Eishes Ach Shelo Hoya Be'ilomoy. So who did Yibum? Zvulun clearly can't do Yibum with Leah. So of Yehuda and Yisachar, Yehuda chose to do Yibum with Shimon's widow, with Leah. And then what happened? And now Levi and Yehuda both died without children. Levi, who had done Yibum with Rachel, who was originally Reuven's wife. Yehuda, who had done Yibum with Leah, who was originally Shimon's wife. Now Levi and Yehuda both died, so Rachel and Leah both have to do Yibum. Who do they have to do Yibum with? Yisachar and Zvulun. Between those two. Well, can they do Yibum? Now everybody agrees that Leah is also to Zvulun, because Zvulun was born before Yehuda did Yibum with Almona of Shimon called Leah. Everybody agrees that Yisachar cannot do Yibum with Rachel, because Yisachar was born before Levi did Yibum to Rachel when she was an Almona of Reuven. So Yisachar can certainly cannot do Yibum with Rachel. Zvulun cannot do Yibum with Leah. The question is, can Zvulun do Yibum with Rachel? And can Yisachar do Yibum with Leah? Now, since everybody agrees that Rachel is also to Yisachar, because Yisachar was born before Levi did Yibum to Rachel, so if Rachel is definitely also to Yisachar, there's no reason in the world that Yisachar cannot do Yibum to Leah. That's okay. That means Asura Lezeh, Muteres Lezeh, since Rachel and Yisachar cannot do Yibum because it's an Erva, Yisachar and Leah can do Yibum. The question is going to be, we need Muteres, Asura Lezeh, Muteres Lezeh, Asura Lezeh, Muteres Lezeh. The question now is, can Rachel do Yibum to Zvulun? Because Leah is certainly also to Zvulun, because Zvulun was born before Yehuda did Yibum with Shimon's almana, Shimon's widow, called Leah. The question is there any reason in the world that Zvulun cannot do Yibum with Rachel? Here we have the Machlekes Reb Shimon and the Chachomim, because Zvulun was born much after Levi did Yibum with Rachel. So according to Reb Shimon says that if the Yibum was done before the brother was born, then, which is this case, then there would be no reason in the world for Zvulun not to be able to do Yibum with Rachel. And since Leah cannot do Yibum with Zvulun, so there's no reason in the world that Rachel cannot do Yibum with Zvulun. However, the Chachomim who argue with Reb Shimon, they say Eishes Ach Shelo Hoyal Ba'olam is a problem even if the brother's born after the widow of the first deceased brother already did Yibum. In which case, since Zvulun and Reuven were not alive at the same time, Zvulun can never do Yibum with Rachel. So Zvulun cannot do Yibum with Leah, because Zvulun was born before anyone did Yibum with Leah. Zvulun cannot do Yibum with Rachel, because even had he been born, even though he was born after Yibum of Rachel, according to the Chachomim, that doesn't help. It's called Eishes Ach Shelo Hoyal Ba'olam. So according to the Chachomim, you never have a case that Zvulun can do Yibum to Rachel, and Yisachar can do Yibum to Leah. We don't have a case of Mutar Lezeh, Osar Lezeh, Osar Lezeh, Mutar Lezeh. According to Reb Shimon, we do. According to Reb Shimon, Yisachar can do Yibum with Leah, and Rachel can do Yibum to Zvulun. That's what it says here. According to Reb Shimon, we would have such a case of Asura Lezeh, Muteres Lezeh, even by Eishes Ach Shelo Hoyal Ba'olam. And what's the sequence? The sequence is Meis Noilad V'Yibim, Meis Noilad V'Yibim. First, Reuven died, then Yisachar was born, and then Levi did Yibum to Rachel, Reuven's widow, and then Meis, and then Shimon died, and then Noila, then Zvulun was born, and then Yibim, and only afterwards Yehuda did Yibum with Leah, Shimon's wife. That's right. And in that case, according to Reb Shimon, Zvulun can do Yibum with Rachel, and Yisachar can do Yibum with Leah. And in Mitzvah Hashem in the next year, we're going to continue with the next Gemara.